Did Paul hallucinate seeing Jesus? I think that's a common claim.
Yeah, that is a common claim. She's right. But, you could look at it and say, well, Paul really doesn't tell us in his letters, Paul on Paul, he doesn't tell us much about the appearance he had. We got to go to the book of Acts for that. And there it's mentioned in Acts chapters 9, I think it was 22 and 26. And it's like a vision. But hallucinations aren't group experiences. They're private occurrences in the mind of an individual. They're false sensory perceptions of something that isn't really there. So they're like dreams. So just like I can't share my dream with my wife. I can't wake her up and say, hey, honey, I'm having a dream that we're in Hawaii. Go back to sleep. Join me in my dream and let's have a free vacation. You can't do that. She might dream she's in Hawaii, but she won't be having the same exact dream I am. She can't join me in my dream because there's no external reality. It's all going on in our head. Same with hallucinations. So even in the book of Acts, it says that Paul's traveling companions saw the light and they heard the voice. They just couldn't understand the voice. So they were part of that experience, which wouldn't be a hallucination. And then Paul later on in Acts chapter 13 talks about Jesus' resurrection being something that happened physically. He quotes from Psalm 16:10, which says, you will not allow your Holy One to see decay. And he says this couldn't have been referring to David because David died, buried, his body decayed. We know where he's buried. But on the other hand, Jesus died, was buried, but his body did not decay. It's referring to Jesus. His body did not decay, inferring that God raised him, and for that they're eyewitnesses. So if you're looking in Paul and Acts, yes, you've got the description of it that sounds more like a vision, but then you've got his traveling companions partake in it as well. And Paul is preaching in a sense that he thinks it's bodily resurrection. Now, when we come to Paul on Paul, not Luke on Paul, but Paul on Paul, and he's describing resurrection, we can get to his thoughts about resurrection through the back door. So because he doesn't explain Jesus' resurrection in detail himself, because he's not given a narrative of the resurrection. He's writing letters, addressing questions. And in 1 Corinthians, he's answering the question, what's the resurrection like? What kind of bodies are we going to get at the general resurrection? There are some people here in Corinth who are saying, we're not going to be raised from the dead. This life is all there is. You die, that's it. And so Paul goes on, he says, well, Christ is the first fruits in chapter 15, verse 20. And then he says in verse 23, after that, those who belong to Christ will be raised at his coming. So when Jesus returns, that's when believers are going to be raised. So what he's saying there's the way Jesus was raised is the way we're going to be raised, only we're going to be raised later on. And then he talks about now. So in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 8, he says, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. In Philippians chapter 1, verses 20, 21, he talks about how, and 22, that he's in prison, he's facing possible execution. He says he could die and be with Christ or remain on in the flesh. And he says that even though he'd rather be with Christ, being in the flesh is very much better for them, more fruitful for them. So what he sees himself is when he dies, his view is when you die, you go to be as a disembodied spirit with Jesus in heaven immediately. And then you go to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, and he's trying to comfort Christians who have lost loved ones. And he says, I don't want you to grieve as those who have no hope, because when Jesus returns, he's going to bring with him those who have died as Christians. And then the trumpet will sound and the dead in Christ will be raised first. Well, wait a minute. If he's bringing the dead back with him, how are they going to be raised first? Very simple. The spirits, the disembodied spirits, are going to be reunited with their corpses, and then they're going to be raised. It's a bodily, physical resurrection, a resurrection and transformation. And remember, if we're raised as Jesus was raised, and if we're going to be raised bodily, physically, that means Paul thought that Jesus was raised in that same sense. So no, it wasn't a vision that he thought.
There you go.
I'm sorry, it wasn't a hallucination. Besides, hallucinations don't account for the group occurrences. And Paul wasn't grieving over Jesus' death. He was glad Jesus was dead. Jesus would have been the last person in the universe that Paul would have expected to see or wanted to see.
Well, let me ask you another one, because Paul the Apostle, his letters are so early. They come before the Gospels. We have information in 1 Corinthians 15 that traces back even earlier than that. And so obviously Paul is like an important chess piece in this discussion. Well, some would say in the mythicist community that Paul, he didn't really believe in a Jesus who died and resurrected on earth. But allow me to quote Richard Carrier, because I think he's an icon. I think he's probably one of the chief icons right now in this community. He says, Paul is ever only talking about a Jesus in outer space that he has conversations with. That's a quote, word for word. Richard Carrier, for those who don't know, he thinks that Paul is envisioning a spiritual being, Jesus, who never came to earth, never interacted on the planet Earth. And later, the gospel writers took this sort of spiritual being and turned him into a human who lived a real earthly life. That's the euhemerization thing I was talking about. So what would you say about interpreting Paul as referring to an outer space Jesus?
That's weird interpretation. I mean, Paul, in the crown jewel of all of his letters, Romans chapter 1, verse 3, it says, concerning his son, who was born of a descendant of David according to the flesh. So he places Jesus clearly as a historical figure. And he mentions about this Jesus being crucified by the rulers of our world. So, I mean, it's just, again, that's just a real stretch that Rick has to go to in order to try to discredit a really good source about Jesus. I mean, I don't know of anyone who really takes, no scholars other than Richard would take that interpretation. I don't know of a single one.